Okay, at the moment I'm really annoyed because I just spent 20 minutes taping a video and it crashed or something happened, things froze. And so anyway, so I'm going to rush through a little more quickly than I had earlier. But this is about Emily Dickinson, and I'm going to start with a little background on Emily Dickinson. And as we go through this semester, you'll kind of figure out I'm not a huge poetry person. There's some certain poets I like, certain I don't. Emily Dickinson, I consider okay. Been teaching her poems for 20 years, and they're about the same to me. Some people get better. James Dickey, every time I read one of his poems, it gets better to me. Emily Dickinson really has sort of stayed the same, but I would be remiss to ignore her. Now, she's one of those people who, again, her works hold up, certainly, but there's sort of the legend to her. And because she didn't publish during her lifetime, she published 11 poems during her lifetime, only one per her that she actually submitted for publication. The other she had sent to friends and various people who had them published without her permission. So one of the big arguments that comes off right off the bat is, did she want to be published? And a lot of people say, no, she definitely was very, very clear about that. But at the same time, sure was sending out a lot of poems to a lot of very influential people to read. Now, she may have just wanted feedback, or she may have wanted someone to beg her to read. And actually what she did, and I created this in the first video that froze, it turned into a Martha Stewart craft moment. But if you take a piece of white paper, right, or several, and fold them together, I did it with two, and fold in half again, right? So there's, so it's about this yay big. And then sew, which is what she would do. She did use more than two pieces of paper. I just wanted to make the point. Sew sort of the seam and then cut around the edges. You create your own sort of little booklet. So which I did with Staples, Allen's poems, right? Which I don't write poetry, but you can see. And then she would do this and then sort of fill these with her various poems. Now, one of the questions becomes, why are they known by titles? Because she didn't give them titles. And why are they known by numbers? Usually it's by the first line, but sometimes they're numbered. And a lot of times you'll see two separate numbers. We don't know what order they were written in. We're not sure about that. And there's also a ton of different versions of her poems. In fact, several of the audio versions I listened to before teaching this had different wording. Now, that's partially her. She would write the same poem over and over, fix it, get feedback, fix it. Because of the dates, we don't know which the final version was because it wasn't clearly dated. The other thing is, when she was first published after her death, her editor, and there's a letter from him or an explanation at the end of her poems, basically changed her poetry to fit the standards of the time, again without all of these hyphens or dashes rather that she uses to separate her work. And so and then later issues kind of went back and there was some confusion, and part of the problem was, besides she wasn't published during her lifetime and didn't keep records of everything, people tended to keep their letters at the time, and so did she, but she also requested, I'm not sure the story here, they're varying stories, but her letters were all destroyed. Her poems were not, but when she died, her letters were all destroyed. And so what we know of her, we know of letters she wrote to other people that they kept, okay, because we don't have any of the correspondence back to her. So we really only have one side of the story when it comes to her. Now, another thing, she was a recluse. We know that. And the more I record this, and I may have said this is my second time around on this video, the more I learn about her, these videos change. And I erroneously, up until today, had said she wasn't really that much of a recluse. She women didn't roam the streets alone at the time and didn't get out of the house that much. But, she actually was very, very social, traveled. And then at 25, she wrote a letter, and I cannot remember to whom. But she said that a terror had struck her. That's all she said. And from that point on, she didn't leave the house. Now, when she would leave the house before, she wore all white. She wore all white around the house, again, giving her this odd image. But after this terror, and we don't know, I mean, did she was her heart broken? Did she see something? Did someone, her mother died? Was it that? Was it, what could it have been? We really just have no clue. All we can really do here is speculate. One of the speculations is that she could have been a lesbian, and critics really argue a lot over this. What I'm actually going to do is, at the end of this, I'm going to let you judge. So at the very end of this video, I have included a letter she wrote to Susan Gilbert, who ended up, she was a friend of Emily Dickinson, and turned out to be her brother's wife. So she became her sister-in-law. But critics will say, "Oh, no, we read this letter erroneously. We should have. That's not what she meant." Da, 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 da. It reads like a love letter, and you can be the person who decides that. Now, to make it seem even more like she may be a lesbian, to give you time to read it, I kind of played music in the background and went with a little Melissa Etheridge, so that may sway your view. But it's an interesting letter, and you can Google it too if it scrolls too quickly for you. Okay, so that really takes us through where we are to this point. So what we're going to do is I'm going to play Because I Could Not Stop for Death, and then we'll come back and I'll make some comments on that.
Because I Could Not Stop for Death by Emily Dickinson. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. We slowly drove, he knew no haste, and I had put away my labor and my leisure too, for his civility. We passed the school where children strove, at recess in the ring. We passed the fields of gazing grain. We passed the setting sun, or rather he passed us. The dews drew quivering and chill, for only gossamer my gown, my tippet only tulle. We paused before a house that seemed a swelling of the ground. The roof was scarcely visible, the cornice in the ground. Since then, 'tis centuries, and yet feels shorter than the day I first surmised the horses' heads were towards eternity.
All right, so I'm going to make some comments about that. First, let me make a couple of notes about the reading and the video. The poem is not centered, and just as we really don't center poems. It's a tacky thing. Very few decent poets ever centered poems. It's kind of a pet peeve of mine. I judge literary magazines, and I'm in charge of the Arkansas Classic Press Association, which is over literary magazines, and it's a real pet peeve. But I had to center it on the page just to make it easier to read. That also was not me reading, someone more dramatic. So the next one will be the same. So let's discuss Because I Could Not Stop for Death. And I'm not really going to focus on the obvious stuff. I think that you kind of understand what's going on here. Because I could not stop for death. So again, the first stanza, she couldn't stop for death. And I love that idea. I didn't have time to stop for death, so he kindly stopped for me. Now, who's in the carriage? So she's in a carriage, and it's interesting to look at death this way, as a sort of carriage ride, or correct, but he takes her away in a carriage. Now notice, there's death, and there's her, and she says, the carriage held but just ourselves, so death, her, and immortality. Okay, so that answers one of her questions. Again, notice, God's not mentioned here. Emily Dickinson's religious feelings on things are very often debated. I'm going to go with agnostic at best. I had a professor in college who was an Emily Dickinson expert, and he said, she didn't care if there was a heaven or hell or a God or whatever. She just wanted there to be an afterlife. Even if she suffered forever, she wanted to be able to remain conscious, right? To be able to think, because that was what was so important to her. But when the question comes up, pay off for those of you who watch the videos, how many things are in the carriage? There are three. The speaker, again, I'm going to say her, but doesn't necessarily have to be Emily Dickinson here. Death and immortality. Again, no hurry is the second stanza. She put away her labor and her leisure too for his civility. And I think what's interesting about that is she puts everything aside. Because, I mean, that's really all we have when you think about it. You're either working or there's leisure. There's really no, I can't think of any purgatory or, any kind of in-between with those two. Now we start looking at what critics kind of obsess over. We passed the school where children strove at recess in the ring, so again childhood. We passed the field of gazing grain, okay, midlife, later life. We passed the setting sun, okay, again rather death, okay. So they pass sort of all of those material things that we experience on Earth, right? With immortality. Those are just little things that we pass. Or rather, he passed us. The do quivering and chill, for only gossamer, and I'm looking off at the poem, for only gossamer, my gown, my tippet only tool. That's going to come back, so I'm going to go back. That's the part I kind of obsess over. We paused before a house, it seemed, a swelling in the ground. The roof was scarcely visible, the cornice in the ground. Again, critics say over and over, this is... again, a house that's fallen, but she can't say we passed my tombstone. And so if you visualize this, it very much looks like a tombstone. And so that's ultimately what they're passing there. And then the last stanza, since then to centuries and yet feels shorter than the day I first surmised the horses' heads were toward eternity. Okay, so again, it's been centuries since the speaker died, but it doesn't feel like that. It feels shorter than the day that she first surmised the horses' heads were toward eternity. Now, a lot of people really obsess, a lot of critics really obsess over this and say she's saying she doesn't figure out she's dead till the very end, right? The horses' heads are towards eternity. I don't buy that. I figured it out in the first line because I could not stop for death. He kindly stopped for me, that she was dead. And I don't think that the speaker doesn't realize it until she realizes the horses' heads were toward eternity. Now, my obsession with this poem the last few years has been death, because let's talk about death here. He kindly, look at this word choice. And again, in Comp 1, if you have me for Comp 1, one of the things I'm obsessed with is dominant impressions. You choose these words that maybe don't really relate directly to what you're saying, but kind of come up over and over again that paint this dominant impression. He kindly stopped for her. Okay, so death is kind, right? He's civil. She put away her labor and her leisure too for his civility. So we see death here as a kind entity. But let's look at this stanza that I skipped over. The dews drew quivering and chill, for only gossamer my gown, my tippet only tulle. Basically what that means is, she's sort of in this carriage ride, and pretty much how she's going to spend eternity, and she's wearing gossamer, which if you read your footnotes is a very thin fabric, as is tulle, and so she's cold, so she's chilly and uncomfortable. And so, is death a trickster here, right? Is he sort of convincing her this is a pleasant thing, but it's not, we generally think of, the unpleasant way of dying as burning in hell forever and being hot. But, again, being cold can be just as bad. And, here we could argue that it's mild discomfort, but it's not, a pleasant way to spend eternity. You know what it's like when you go out and you're inappropriately dressed and it's too cold. And pretty much she's spending eternity this way. And so it's interesting that, death kind of tricked her into this. And so it's an interesting take on this. Another thing that I didn't mention in the introduction is this obsession with death. And we see it in both of the poems that we do and a lot of the poems that she does. Now, she is wrangling with religion. Is there an afterlife? Is there a God? Is there, what happens with death? Her mother died when young, and so she's experienced that. There's also, we forget this, and my niece is going into the 10th grade, and she's doing a novel years ago in between college teaching. I had to do a 6-year stint in high school, and 3 years I taught a separate piece. by John Knowles. And my niece is reading it for the first time, and one of the lines really stuck out to me. He says it takes place during World War II, but at an all-boys school where they're too young to be drafted yet. And he said, my life will always be basically defined by that. War will always be going on. Soldiers will always be coming home. People will always be dying. And Emily Dickinson was living during the Civil War. She wasn't published until after her death, and so after the Civil War. But in Amherst, Massachusetts, she's not in the center of this, but there's just no way to escape that. She's going to see soldiers coming home, missing limbs, coming home in coffins, all of those sorts of things. And so, is she obsessed with death because she's just obsessed with death? Or is she obsessed with death because, if you were living during the Civil War, you would be too? We don't really know. Or is it a little bit of both? I think that's where we are. Now, I'm going to move on in the next video to I Heard a Fly Buzz When I Died. And I'm going to show first, again, someone else reading, this time a woman, reading the poem, and then I'm going to move in. It goes directly from that to a scene from the movie Poltergeist, and that's going to. So if you're like, "What the hell is going on?" That's going to come back up when we discuss I Heard a Fly Buzz When I Died. So I'll see you after that poem.
I heard a fly buzz when I died. The stillness in the room was like the stillness in the air between the heaves of storm. The eyes around had wrung them dry, and breaths were gathering firm for that last onset when the king be witnessed in the room. I willed my keepsakes, signed away what portion of me be assignable. And then it was there interposed a fly with blue, uncertain, stumbling buzz between the light and me. And then the windows failed, and then I could not see to see.
You said no!
There is peace and serenity in the light.
You said don't go into the light!
Okay, let's bring this bad boy home, shall we? Now, critics look at this poem, and the most common interpretation is sort of this moment of death, which is really, important, and, flies representing death. Also could be Satan in the room. A lot of critics have said. We've got this idea of the buzz. Again, that's onomatopoeia, right? Storm, the eyes, the king. That's a big thing, right? She capitalizes king there, and is king death or is king God, right? So where does she stand on this religious aspect of all of this? So that's something that very often comes up. Most people see this as her looking for, again, there's the material world, what she has, and life, and all of these other things, and then the ethereal, what's after, and there's this annoying, fly in the way, and there's that aspect of this, and she, another thing to note here is the blue, uncertain, stumbling buzz. Again, blue buzz, that's what we call synesthesia. That's one of your literary terms, as well as onomatopoeia. And what that means is synesthesia is when we perceive something with a sense we can't perceive. Again, buzz being a sound. How can a sound have color, which is something we would perceive through vision, right? Which again could relate to this death thing where we're perceiving things with the wrong senses. Could be a device by Dickinson. Again, we don't know. And then finally, the windows fail, and she could not see to see. Again, people say that, the critics will say that means the closing of the eyes. I interpret this a little differently, than a lot of critics do. And I'm going to take you through that. You can agree, you can disagree. There may be people out there who've Googled this video and think this guy's crazy, but I want you to think about it this way. We know that Emily Dickinson had a sense of humor, and I love this idea of the fly. Between her and the light. Again, that's why we watch Poltergeist, right? It's just, this is a common idea that there's the light on the other side. Again, in the movie, she wants her to go near the light for whatever reason to pull her out, but the family's scared because that light is death. Should she cross over, she dies, and so it's a very famous scene from the movie. But to me, what this is about is, again, a woman or a man, again, we don't know who the speaker is. We tend to assume it's Emily Dickinson, but we don't know. I heard a fly buzz when I died. The stillness in the room was like the stillness in the air between the heaves of storm. And so we know between the heaves of storm, it's like calmness between storm. So I love that idea. It's completely calm. And then there's this damn fly, right? Buzzing, annoying. And you know how annoying a fly can be. And so I think she's kind of being funny here. The eyes around had hung them dry. The breaths were gathering firm for that last onset when the king be witnessed in the room. If you ever watched someone die, my grandmother had Alzheimer's and had a stroke, and so she was no code because, basically, what's the point in, she had Alzheimer's and was pretty much, brain dead anyway. And then she had a stroke, so we knew afterwards, if we'd kept her alive, what's the point? And so you sort of sit there waiting for someone to dehydrate, right? And so someone's going to die, and you the breaths gather firm, right? Nobody's, you're just kind of waiting for the breathing to stop, for the flat line to begin, for the, for death to come. The eyes around had wrung them dry. I love this idea too. Again, what does that mean? Everybody's cried as much as they can cry. They're over it. And so they're just ready for her to die. They've accepted it. I willed my keepsake, signed away what portions of me be assignable. Okay, so I like this idea, because one of the things you'll know with death is if you come from a family that has any money, or anybody has anything anybody wants. If there's not a will, and it's not, even if there is a will, and it's not very, very, very explicit on who gets what, the mood becomes ugly, right? People are fighting over minor things. And so her point here is everything's been assigned. Everything that she owns, there is no fight, okay? Once she dies, there is no argument. What's willed is willed, okay? The mood's not going to turn ugly over that. She's handled everything, and so it should be the perfect death, right? But, and then there interposed a fly. So at this moment, that's everything's set up for. Everything should be perfect. It should be kind of the perfect death. There's this just annoying fly, right? With blue, uncertain, stumbling buzz between the light and me. I love that idea. Okay, so she's got the light's right there. She's going to cross over children, right? She's going to move into the light and die and meet the, and go on to eternity. But there's this damn fly in the way of all of that. And I love the idea. See, I read these last two lines, and then the windows plural failed, and then I could not see to see. Okay, yes, of course you can read this as her eyes closing and the light, failing. But what I kind of think of it as is, if you've ever lived in an older home, or in a home that was built at the time Emily Dickinson lived, windows can be very difficult to open. And of course, what do you do when there's a fly in the room, right? You open a door, you open the windows. And so what I kind of like about this is this idea that what I see is, by the windows failing, people are struggling to open them, right? To get this fly out. And so when she enters the afterlife, when she walks into the light, not only is there a fly there, but the room is in a panic. Everyone who should be set up exactly, everyone who, everything is set up exactly the way death is supposed to go. And how does she enter the afterlife? She enters into a panic because people are scrambling to open the doors. People are doing everything they can to get this fly out of the room, because that's not how death should be, right? Especially when you've set it up as this perfect situation. And so I interpret this a little differently. Again, you can read it both ways, and who's to say Emily Dickinson didn't intend it both ways. But, I think it's a little tongue-in-cheek here. I think, again, that first line, I heard a fly buzz when I died, she has to know. that's a little humorous to readers. And so, anyway, that's my sort of take on it. Okay. If you have any questions about these, again, always call me. Now, after I shut up here, we're going to move into the letter she wrote to Susan Gilbert. You can judge if it was a love letter or not, and I'll see you in the next video.
I'm not the sort of person who falls in and quickly out of love, but to you I gave my affection right from the start. I have a lover who loves me. How could I break such a heart? Yet still you get my attention. Why do you come here when you know I've got troubles enough? Why do you call me when you know I can't answer the phone? You make me lie when I don't want to, and you make someone else some kind of an unknowing fool, and you make me stay when I should not. Are you so strong, or is all the weakness in me? Why do you come here and pretend to be just passing by? But I mean to see you, and I mean to hold you tightly. Feeling guilty, worried, waking from tormented sleep. Oh, this old love has me bound, but a new love cuts deep. If I choose now, I'll lose out. Oh, one of you has to fall, and I need you, and you. Why do you come here when you know I've got troubles enough? Why do you call me when you know I can't answer the phone? You make me lie when I don't want to, and you make someone else some kind of an unknowing fool, and you make me stay when I should not. Are you so strong, or is all the weakness in me? Why do you come here and pretend to be just passing by? But I mean to see you, and I mean to hold you tight.
Loibner-Waitkus.